Welcome to King on Kings, a show where I interview some of the more well-known kings of Israel and Judah. This week's guest is King David.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
David, you were an incredibly famous king. You won battles, fought armies. Your most crowning achievement, you, King David, killed Goliath with a slingshot. Wow. I mean, wow.
Well, that was a pretty awesome day. I mean, let me tell you.
Your predecessor, King Saul, was kind of special too, but the girls used to sing, Saul killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands.
Well, I do seem to remember a little ditty like that. It was top of the charts, in fact, and even available on iTunes.
And what about this? A quote from God. God, the God, called you, and I quote, a man after God's own heart. David, you really are one of a kind.
Well, I don't know if I'm so much one of a kind, but, I try to be a good role model, as a king's supposed to be.
Tell me about Bathsheba.
Mr. King, I really don't want to talk about her.
That's a problem. You committed adultery with Bathsheba, isn't that right?
Have you heard the story about when I was hiding in a cave?
You committed adultery with Bathsheba and got her pregnant.
I admitted that. I mean, I already apologized.
And when you found out she was pregnant, you had her husband murdered.
Well, I mean, not really murdered. I mean, I just kind of...
You put him in the front lines where he stood no chance of survival.
Yeah, but...
Answer me this one question. Are you the greatest king of Israel?
No.
I'm sorry, that's all the time we have. This is King on Kings. Next week, our guest will be King Jehu. Have a very Merry Christmas.
All right, well, good morning. And you're like, okay, we get to be one of those videos? Okay, so we're doing something very unique. We're taking a different approach this year as we lead up to Christmas. We're going to be using one of my favorite words. We're going to be looking at the predecessors of Jesus, the other kings of Israel, the people that came before him. We're going to be looking at King David and Jehu and Hezekiah and Zedekiah, and we're going to be looking at those kings and their kingdom and their reign, and we're going to, this is one of my favorite words, we're going to juxtapose, I love to juxtapose things, right? I love to juxtapose my sweet and sour chicken. Anyway, so we're gonna juxtapose the kingdoms, the predecessors of Jesus to the kingdom of Jesus. And we're going to show the difference between that and why it was so incredibly powerful when in Bethlehem a new king, the final king of Israel, was born. And so to do that, I want to just start off today by sort of solidifying the authority of God, God's authority. And this is why this is big. Because we get used to a certain org chart in our world, right? We know that there are certain leaders and there's people with power and there's people with control in this world. In our own country, I mean, you've got major city mayors, you've got governors, senators, Congress, you've got ultimately the President of the United States, who is often called what? The most powerful man in the world. And on top of that, globally, you've got the United Nations, and you've got leaders, and you've got dictators, and you see it on the news all the time, people like Kim Jong-un and President Putin, and just all across the globe, we recognize and are reminded constantly that these are the people calling the shots. These are the people who are in control, and these are the people in power, and that's the way the world works. But we need reminded that there is a whole nother level to that org chart. It is an unseen authority that dominates all of that, and that is God's authority. God is the one ultimately in control and in power. I came across this passage, and it's one of those passages this week I was reading, I'm going, I've read that before, but I've never really caught the power of the verse, the authority of the verse. In the end of 2 Timothy, Paul describes God, and he just doesn't say God, as Paul is known to do in the New Testament. He says God, and then he defines who he means by God. Let me read to you 1 Timothy chapter 6. Paul says this, God, the blessed and only ruler, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, who alone is immortal and who lives in unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. To him be honor and might forever. Amen. That's who God is. God has ultimate power and ultimate control. And every other leader that exists on this planet is completely subject to him. That's God's authority. And with God's authority, he appointed 2,000 years ago in the place of Galilee, he appointed a new king, a king of his people. And that king was Jesus. Philippians chapter 2 describes how God appointed him. Verse 8, and being found in an appearance as a man, he, talking about Jesus, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Jesus is King. He has been appointed as King by the authority of the Most High God. And he has a very literal kingdom. That's not just an analogy. It's like, oh yeah, he's kind of like a king, he's kind of like a ruler. No. He's actually a king, and he has a kingdom. And sometimes we miss it because it's hard to describe, but his kingdom, Jesus took a moment and explained his kingdom to, of all people, Pilate. Jesus took a moment to explain to Pilate, right before he was crucified, what his kingdom was like. It says in John chapter 18, Jesus turned to Pilate and said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. I want you to understand this. When he says that, he doesn't mean that it's a kingdom that's off in the clouds and one day you'll see the kingdom. When he talks about his kingdom being from another place, it doesn't mean that one day we're going to die and we're going to go be a part of the kingdom. No, he said his subjects, his servants, are here on earth. Headquarters are somewhere else. The palace is somewhere else. The king lives somewhere else. But here and now, the kingdom of God is present. And it is a very literal, very real kingdom. And everybody who believes in and follows Christ is a subject to King Jesus. Now, why am I making this point? Because I really want to ask this question, and this is the question of the whole series. This is the question we're going to ask each week, and hopefully we can answer each week. We're going to ask this question. Why don't you trust your King? Now, I think that's a good question for everybody in here, and maybe you've just started coming to church, and maybe you really haven't jumped in, and you've heard us talk about baptism, and you're like, yeah, I don't know, I'm not there yet, I'm learning, I'm growing, but I just don't feel like I'm ready to take that dive. And you might look at that question and go, yeah, I don't trust him. And that's actually a really good question. Why don't I trust him? Why don't I jump in? Why don't I do that? Or maybe for some of you, you've been a Christian for several months, maybe a year, maybe 5, maybe more than that. You've been a Christian for a long time. And you look at that question, you're like, oh, I can check that box. I trust my King. I trust Jesus. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But really, why don't you trust your King? Why don't you just do whatever his word says? Why don't you just jump in with both feet? Why, when you pray, are you still anxious about things? Why is the world falling apart when you trust your King? Really, answer this question. Why don't you trust your King? And I think as we drill down on that and we begin to talk about that over the next couple of weeks, I think what you're going to find is the answer to that is because what you have experienced is not trust in the leaders in your life. Whether it was your parents, or it was a leader, or it was the president, or it was a governor, or a mayor, or it was your pastor. There was somebody in your life. There was a human being, and you couldn't trust them. They failed you. They dropped the ball. Even the best ones really left you hanging. And you had people up on pedestals and they just like jumped off the pedestal. And you go, yeah, I can't really fully trust any leader. And we want to make the point that Jesus is not like any leader you have ever experienced before in your life. Jesus is a king, and this is a king that you can trust. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at, like I said, we're going to look at these Old Testament kings. And we're going to look at some of the best ones. Today we're going to look at King David. David was one of the best kings. And we're going to look at his kingdom and his leadership, and we're going to see that there is an incredible gap between one of the best leaders in the Bible and arguably in world history. There is a big gap between David and the kingdom of Jesus. And you need to view Jesus' kingship and his kingdom completely different from any kingdom you've ever experienced before. So the first one we're looking at, David. David was good. And if you've been here very long, you know that I kind of like bring up David whenever I can. I mean, I can bring him into any conversation. You come up and ask me a question about anything, and I'll bring up David because I am fascinated by this dude's life. It is amazing. And if you've never read the story of David's life before, you need to go home. You need to open up 2 Samuel, start in 1 Samuel. 1 and 2 Samuel are just this incredible story of David experiencing anything that you could possibly imagine. Anything that you've experienced, David went through something almost identical, and he handled it so weird, but so good. And so if you've never read this story before, go home and read it. But I'm fascinated by the life of David because here's the thing. David was good. I mean, he was one of the good ones. I got some bullet points just to kind of catch you up on the good side of David. The first one is this. David had this courage, and courage that was amazing. He starts off his leadership as a teenager killing Goliath. And if you've never read the story of David, and you've like, oh yeah, I know the story. He goes up there, there's a giant, he gets some stones. If you've never read the story, you've got to go home and read the story. The words, there is such power in David's words. I mean, he walked out on that field. He didn't walk out there kind of with a slingshot and he was like, well, I hope everything works out all right, you know. He didn't do that. He walked out on that field like LeBron James walks onto a basketball court. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he knew he was going to come away with a win because he had that much courage, that much faith, that much trust in God. And he goes up and he destroys Goliath while the rest of Israel's armies are quaking in their boots. The second thing he had is he had integrity in weakness. There's this amazing, weird story about how he's running from the previous king Saul, and Saul's trying to hunt him down because he's filled with jealousy and insecurity and fear. And David spends his whole life, or the first half of his life, running from this crazy madman who literally was crazy. You know how sometimes I call people crazy? Well, he was really crazy. Like the spirit would overtake him and he would just get like blood in his eyes and foam in his mouth and he would just go try to kill David. David spends his time running from Saul. And David never took the advantage or the opportunity to kill Saul because he viewed him as God's anointed, and he never did the wrong thing. Such integrity his entire life, which led to, ultimately, and this is the beautiful part about David and his life, it led to humility at all times because he had seen himself at the end of his rope. One of my favorite stories. I've brought this up several times, but I'm going to bring it up again because it's my favorite story. David is hiding from Saul, and because he's got to hide from Saul, he's got to hide among his enemies. That's how desperate he is, that he's going to go hide. Here he's a hero of Israel, and the Philistines want to kill him like crazy, so he goes and hides among his enemies because that's the only place left he's got to go. And somebody spots him and points him out to the king of the Philistines and says, look, that's David. And David was literally out of options. He didn't have any other way to turn. And so what did David do? He got down on the ground and started scratching at the doorpost and letting drool run down his beard and acting like a crazy person so that he wouldn't die. That's literally at the end of your rope, because once you do that to save your life, you're just like, the king looked over at him. And I love what the king responded. The king of the Philistines looked at him. They're getting ready to kill him, and they looked at him and he's like, don't I have enough madmen already? Aren't there enough crazy people around me already? I don't need this guy. So he just lets him off the hook. And so David developed this incredible humility in his life. And if his life would have ended right there after he became king, it would have been just phenomenal. He would have gone, there is nobody like David. But even with our heroes, there's flaws, there's problems. And the problem is, and this is really getting down at the root of it wasn't that they made an unwise decision. It wasn't that they kind of, did something that some people disagreed with. When it comes down to the real problem of every great hero and every great leader that you've ever known, I don't care who you're talking about. Heroes in our country, Abraham Lincoln. For some of you, actually have a picture of Ronald Reagan in your house, right? I mean, you've got, some of you, maybe it's Bill Clinton, I don't know. Anyway, you've got these heroes in your life, and when they make a mistake, what the problem is, and this is the real problem, is they get selfish. David makes this shift after all the stuff he's been through, where he all of a sudden, towards the later half of his life, and I'm just going to warn some of you more mature fellas, old guys, I'm just going to warn you guys, this is something that happens in your life. You get to a place where you're not the young guy that killed Goliath anymore. You're the guy that, maybe nobody's paying attention to anymore. Maybe you're a little insecure. This is kind of like David's midlife crisis. And David gets to this point in his life where he becomes really self-absorbed all of a sudden. The first story, as you guys probably have heard about, is David and Bathsheba. I'm gonna kind of go through this real quick because you probably know the story, but David's just up on his rooftop one day. He's supposed to be off at war. He's supposed to be out there being king, but he's like, you know what, it's covered. So he goes out on his rooftop. Now, here's the thing. I told my wife, if we ever build a house, I want to build a house with a rooftop like the way they used to, because they didn't have like a den, they didn't have a recliner. That's not where a guy would go. A guy would go up on his rooftop, and from there you could watch the sunset, and you could do. I would just love one of these in my house because you can do anything up there. You can pray, and it would just be fantastic. It would be a great place to just go and get away from your family. You know what I mean? Anyway, so that's what David was doing. He's up on a rooftop, and he's just enjoying his day. He's not spying on anybody, and he just looks down and he sees this beautiful woman, Bathsheba, this beautiful married woman. And in his younger days, when he was running from his enemy, and sometimes you wonder why God doesn't let you win the lottery or give you everything that you want, I'll tell you why. This is why. Because in his younger days, he would have never dreamed of even taking a second look. He would have said, no. But he is king, and he has gotten everything that he wants, and he's feeling pretty high on himself, and he gets a little self-absorbed, and he has somebody in the palace go and bring her to the palace. He sleeps with her and gets her pregnant, which I think was actually an act of God, because if you read the story, she was just coming off her monthly cycle. You're like, too much information. She was just coming off of her cycle. She shouldn't have been fertile. Don't ask me how I know that. Anyway, she gets pregnant, and now David's got a really big problem. And in his younger days, he would have said, Lord, I've sinned, this was wrong. But David is so concerned about what his reputation, he's worried about his legacy. He's worried about how it's going to be written down, so he wants to cover it up. And so he's like, okay, well, and he tries to get her husband. He gets a husband in there, and he tries to get her to, for them to get together and sleep together and stuff. But her husband is an incredible guy. Uriah was an amazing man. In fact, David had this kind of elite group of men that were like his Navy SEALs. It was 40 out of the thousands of soldiers in David's army. He had this group of 40 men, and Uriah was one of his mighty men. And he was completely committed to the nation of Israel. So David doesn't know what to do. He can't get this to happen. And so he goes and he says this line to his commander, Joab. And I just want you to catch, I wanted to read this to you because I wanted you to see how completely self-absorbed David is right now, how worried he is, how filled with fear he is. He's not the king of his youth. He's not the man of his youth. He is a new guy. In 2 Samuel, verse 11, it says, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, his army commander, wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is the fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and to die. I can imagine having that thought. It's a good thought. Can you imagine writing it down, sealing it in an envelope, and handing it to Uriah to give to Joab? So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at the place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. David just didn't put Uriah at risk. He allowed some of his soldiers, his best men, to die so that he could cover this up. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Now, I've always said, hey, they ought to make a movie about David. That would be incredible, right? That would be awesome, all the miracles and the slaying of Goliath. But then I get to thinking about it. If you were to put this on Lifetime, right? You were to put this like this. There is no way to paint a happy picture on this. This is horrible. Uriah dies, and then guess what happens? He has the audacity to, which was the right thing to do, but he had the audacity to marry Bathsheba, the woman whose husband he had killed. And all of a sudden, David gets busted. And that's what's crazy about this story. David never admits to it. He got away with it. Honestly, he got away with it. Nobody but Joab knew. I mean, he was off scot-free. And then all of a sudden, one day, a prophet from the Lord shows up, and he rebukes David, and he gives him a big analogy, and he points it out, and David is crushed under the weight of his guilt. And God turns to him, and he says, and now I am going to punish you. First off, the baby that Bathsheba's pregnant with, your son, he's going to die. Second thing is, I want you to pick your switch. God invented picking the switch. He said, I'm going to give you 3 options. And he gave him 3 options, and he said, this is how I'm going to punish him. Which option do you want? And David said, I'll take the plague. I'll take the plague. And so God came and he destroyed 70,000 of Israel's people. And why did all of this happen? Because David got focused on himself. He wasn't serving the people anymore. He wasn't doing God's will anymore. He was just looking at his own insecurity, his own weakness, his own fear, his own sexual appetites. He was focused on himself. Second thing about David. David also did that, but one of the lesser known big things that David actually did is at the end of his life, David did like a really horrible thing. All of a sudden one day, David decided that he was going to take a census. So he's at the kind of near the end of his reign, and he's looking out at all his people. And one day, I think he probably just walked out and he went, wow, I'm kind of a big deal. And he started looking at all of his soldiers, and he started looking at how much God had blessed the kingdom, and he started looking around, and again, I'd warned some of you old guys about this. He started looking around, and he started going, man, I am awesome. Like, basically, the nation of Israel owes me everything. In fact, I wonder how big a deal I am. And so he ordered that a census would be taken, and he asked Joab to go out and count all of the fighting men so that he could kind of put that as a notch in his resume. And so he says this in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. He says, so David said to Joab and the commanders of the troops, go and count the Israelites from Beersheba to Dan. Then report back to me so that I may know how many there are. But Joab replied. And let me clarify this. If you read the story, you'll realize that Joab is not a good guy. Right? As you go through the story, Joab is actually like one of the worst people. And at the end, David asks his son Solomon to kill Joab because Joab isn't a good guy. But even Joab realizes in this moment, this is a dumb thing to do. But Joab replied, "May the Lord multiply his troops 100 times over. My lord the king, are they not all my lord's subjects? Why does my lord want to do this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel?" You might be going, well, why is that such a bad thing? Why is that such a big deal? It's actually because God commanded very specifically when He formed the nation of Israel several hundred years ago in the day of Moses. God said, if you're going to count the people, if you're going to get up and say, hey, look at how big the nation of Israel is, look at how many fighting men we have, look at how big we are, that glory needs to go to God, where it is due, because it is He who made the nation of Israel from the very beginning. And so He said this in the book of Exodus. He said this. This is the command He gave to David. Then the Lord said, He gave to Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, when you take a census, when you count the people, census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life. In other words, you want to be a part of God's people and you want to be counted among God's people, you're going to pay your $50 or whatever it was, and you're going to be in that, and it's going to be a tithe to the Lord. Ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them. So God actually had this set up. Listen, I'm not going to call for a census a lot, but when I do call for a census, you're going to pay, and we're going to take this money. And then guess where the money was supposed to go? It was supposed to go to the tabernacle, to the temple, to display, to kind of fortify God's glory on the earth. A census, numbering people, was meant to glorify God. And David's coming along and saying, no, I just want to count everybody so I can tell my mom. So I tell my best friend from high school, so everybody will know when they write this down, King David made this happen. It continues in 1 Chronicles. The king's word, however, overruled Joab. So Joab left and went through Israel and then came back to Jerusalem. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to David. In all, there were 1,100,000 men who could handle a sword, including 470,000 in Judah. But Joab did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering because the king's command was repulsive to him. This command was also evil in the sight of God, so he punished Israel with the plague that swept out 70,000 of his people. Then David said to God, I have sinned greatly by doing this. Now I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. And again, David doesn't have the best interest of Israel and God's people in his heart. As good a guy as David was, David got really self-absorbed and focused on himself. And this is the kind of leader that you are accustomed to. Right? You remember that brief time in your life where you had a good boss? You remember that brief time in your life where you had a good pastor? Maybe that's right now. You don't know me yet, right? You remember that brief time in your life where you really respected that one person, and then all of a sudden you saw their flaws and you realized they weren't always there for you, and they were just really self-absorbed, and you got convinced, and here's the gap, you got convinced that they weren't always looking out for your best interest. And all of us have experienced that, and so here's what we do with God. We go, oh yeah, God's king. But we don't realize that Jesus, your king, has always got, first and foremost, your best interest in mind. Jesus is always pursuing your best interest. From the day you were born, every second, every minute of your life, Jesus has been pursuing what is absolutely best for you. He doesn't have self-absorbed moments. He doesn't get old and insecure. He doesn't have insecurities. There aren't times where you need Him the most, where He's off on some far corner of the galaxy playing golf with Han Solo, right? Well, He may do that, but He's present here too. Jesus has always had your best interest in mind every moment of your life, and He's working you towards that path. And you're sitting out there going, I don't know if you know my life. I don't know if you know what has happened to me or the things I've gone through or the things I'm going through, but it doesn't really feel like Jesus has my best interest in mind. And I'm like, well, of course it doesn't feel like it, right? I mean, think about what God's got to do. God's got to somehow guide you and lead you away from the place you want to go the most. And He's got to take you to a place, lead you and guide you, but in the same moment, it's got to be your own decision. He's got to lead you and guide you to the place you want to go the least. He is trying to shape and guide, and He's been doing this every moment of His life. Of course, it's not going to feel very good when He leads you there. Most of you all know, grew up on a farm. We had some cattle in Nebraska. Not a big cattle operation. We'd have 40 or 50 head of cattle or something like that. But we would have these calves, and these calves, when they get to be a couple of months old, they're still not weaned, right? They're still on mama. But they are strong, and they are quick, and they jump, and they're crazy. And some of them, they just go through this really wild, like, teenage phase. I guess, I don't know. They're just really wild. And they start jumping fences and they're getting through. And when they get out of a fence, a calf like that, and when they put their mind to it, is kind of really hard to catch. And so what we do is we get on our dirt bikes and our three-wheelers, and it kind of feels like the Thunderdome, right? So we get out there and we just, we're trying to rile them in and everything, and we get out in front of them, and they kind of go the one direction, and then they kind of get around behind us, and they take off again. So we go out around, we're on other people's property, we're going through other people's cornfields and stuff like that. We're trying to get this calf back, and we'll sometimes get them guided back towards where they're supposed to go, but they keep trying to run. And if it gets to that point, what we'll do is we'll get out a rope, and we'll either, because we didn't have horses, we'll either drive up alongside of them in the back of a truck, right? It's fun to be a farmer. There's really nothing like it. You just get up there in the back of a truck, right, and you throw the rope and you get it around their legs, and then you just pull it back, and whoa, they fall on the ground. And then two guys grabs the calf, throws them back of the truck. One guy puts his knee on its neck, and the other one gets it in kind of one of these holds on the back leg, and that calf is going, I know some of you city-loving animal lovers are just freaking out. Enjoy your 99-cent double cheeseburger. Anyway, so we're doing this, and we're trying to get it back because we don't want it to die. It'll get eaten by a pack of wolves. It'll freeze from exposure. It'll starve to death without mama. We're trying to get it back to mama, and we're trying to guide it back. Now, here's the point. My point isn't that God is the farmer, because that analogy breaks down real quick when we fatten up the calf and take it to slaughter for money, okay? That's not the analogy. It's terrible. The analogy is that you are just like a calf. That calf has no perception of what's happening. It doesn't realize it's being guided. It doesn't know it's being led. It doesn't know it's being taken back to mom. It just knows that it's trying to stay away from the loud noises, and it doesn't like what's happening. And most of us spend our lives living that way. God is lovingly, carefully trying to guide us and lead us, and sometimes that hurts, and sometimes we go through things we want, and sometimes the places we want to go the most and the people we want to be with the most, God says no, and God guides us away from them, and the prayers we want the most, God's guiding us away from, and God's saying, I just want you to come back home because I have the best possible thing in mind for you. And I just want you to know, God is pursuing your best interest at all times in your life. And you might be sitting out there going, well, how do you know that? How do you know that God doesn't get self-absorbed and He's not just moving us around like chess pieces? How do you know that? I know that because Jesus had His opportunity. Jesus had His opportunity in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was at the moment where He was getting ready to experience the cross, where He was getting ready to do what no king in his right mind would ever do for you. He was getting ready to be crucified for you, and He kneeled before the Father and He said, God, I don't want to do this, but not my will, yours be done. I am committed to you, and I am committed to them, and I have their best interest in mind for every moment of every day of their entire life, and if this is what needs to happen, then I will do it. And moments later, Jesus was betrayed, arrested, beaten, mocked, crucified, because Jesus, your King, loves you that much. And so today I just want to ask you this. Why don't you trust your King? He's not like any other king you've ever known. He's not like any other leader you've ever known. He passionately, desperately cares for you. And every moment of your life, He is looking for your best interest. So why not jump? Why not just completely yield? Why hold back? Why not just open up the Bible and says, this is what my king says to do, and I don't know if I always understand it, but I'm going to do it. Why hold back? Why sit out there going, another baptism service that we have at the church, and you're going, yeah, I should probably do that one of these days. Why hold back? Why keep yourself from completely, fully, finally submitting to God, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords? Let me pray for you.